guys, it's Miss Simpson, and today we are talking about food chains and food webs in science. And before we get started, we're going to talk about interdependence. Let me hear you say interdependence. All right, good job. So every ecosystem has specific organisms that live there. The organisms within an ecosystem rely on each other in some way. So all of the people or all of the animals that live somewhere, we rely on each other in some way, and that is called interdependence. Most of the time, organisms depend on each other for energy. We're going to learn how to track this energy in an ecosystem. Usually, food chains are used to represent how energy travels through an ecosystem. And raise your hand if you've ever heard of a food chain. All right. A food chain is a linear, that means left to right, a linear representation of how organisms rely on each other within an ecosystem. So when we create a food chain, only organisms from the same ecosystem can be used. So a polar bear and a giraffe cannot be in the same food chain because they do not live in the same environment. So we're going to drag and drop each animal into the correct ecosystem. So this is like a forest, maybe the prairie, and this looks like the tundra. So where do you think the owl goes? Owls need trees, so I feel like an owl would go in the forest. What about a giraffe? Maybe right here. What about this bird? I'm thinking either this one or this one. But I would probably put it here. Whoa. What about this deer? I would probably put the deer in the forest too. What about the fish? Ooh, hard one. I'm going to put the fish over here because there are fish in this water. The lion would probably be with the giraffe. The bunny would probably be with the forest. The hyena would probably be with the giraffe. The penguin, needs to be in the water. The whale has to be in the water. This little friend, probably in the forest. Ooh, I don't know. This one looks like a deer. No, I've seen those out in this kind of area. And then a snake would probably be in the forest. All right, so you have to have food chains that have the animals that actually go with that food chain. So this is a temperate forest. This is a food chain representing the relationships between some organisms in this ecosystem. So as a plant, the berry bushes use energy from the sun to make its own food. So they get energy from the sun. Then the energy from the berry bush transfers to the rabbit because the rabbit eats the berries. Then once the owl eats the rabbit, the energy from the rabbit and the berry bush go into the owl because the owl eats the rabbit. And then after all these organisms have died, their energy is given to the mushroom, and the cycle will continue. The berries, then the rabbit eats the berries, the owl eats the rabbit, and then they're decomposed. So let's talk about all these different pieces. They all have a different name. So a producer. A producer is like this berry bush. It's a plant. These plants use energy from our sun to create food inside of their leaves. So we eat plants, so we can get energy from the plants that we eat. Organisms that use the sun's energy to create their own food are called producers. So plants are all producers, and that's typically how we start off our food chain. After the sun, we have our plants. Produce, that word means to make. So producers like grasses, fruits, vegetables, trees, and flowers, they make their own food through a process called photosynthesis. So they don't eat anything because we have to eat something to get our energy. They don't eat anything. They make their own food, and they do that by doing a process called photosynthesis. A producer always comes first in a food chain because people and animals cannot make food in their bodies using energy from the sun. So we can't just lay out by a pool and be full from the sun's energy. We have to eat something else. Every food chain will only have one producer unless the decomposer of the food chain is a type of plant. So just like, which we'll go over in a second, but just like the mushrooms, it's also a type of plant. So we have a producer. Then we have consumers. So rabbits can't make their own food by just standing out in the sunlight next to a pool. They have to eat plants to gain their energy. So when we eat something, we consume it. That's what it's called. So when you eat your favorite snack, you're consuming it. So after the producer in a food chain After the producer in a food chain, we see our consumer. The consumers need to eat other living organisms to gain their energy. This rabbit is the first consumer that we see in this food chain. So it is the primary or first consumer. So let's go back. We have our producer. Then we have our primary consumer, and it's primary because it's the first one. And then we have our another consumer, and that is our owl. The owl eats the rabbit to get its energy. So it is also a consumer, and it's the second consumer in the food chain. So it's called the secondary consumer. If there is a third consumer in the food chain, it would need to consume the owl, and it would be a tertiary consumer. So let's look again. We have our producer, the berries. Then we have our primary consumer, which is the rabbit. Our secondary consumer, which is the owl, and then there is not a tertiary consumer, which would be something that could eat an owl. Then we have our decomposer. So all living things, they eventually die and they start to decay. So that means they get all nasty and broken down. Organisms called decomposers help organisms decay once they have died. The nutrients from these decaying organisms, like that owl, would get recycled back into the soil so that more producers can grow, and the process starts all over again. These deconsumers can be plants or animals, so they can be mushrooms, worms, vultures, bottom feeders such as shrimp, krill, and phytoplankton. So let's go back to our food chain. We have our producer, our berries, our primary consumer, our rabbit, our secondary consumer, our owl, and then our mushroom is the decomposer. So the arrows in the food chain, the arrows in a food chain show where the energy is going. So look right here. The energy from this berry goes to the rabbit. And from the rabbit, the energy goes to the owl. And from the owl, it goes back to the decomposer. So let's go ahead and drag and drop our terms to correctly label the organism. So which one of these is our producer? Producers are plants. I hope that you said this tree is our producer because producers are plants. So then we have the giraffe is going to eat the producer. So what would the giraffe be called? Primary consumer, secondary consumer, or decomposer? It would definitely be this. If this would let me drag it, it would definitely be this primary consumer. Okay, it's not letting me drag this. Here we go. So then after this, what would you have? The hyena ate the giraffe. So what is the hyena called? The secondary consumer, right? And then this vulture is called the decomposer because once the hyena dies, it will eat the decomposer. So here are the 4 different types of consumers. So we have our producers. We know that they are all plants. We have our decomposers, fungi, mushrooms, vultures, shrimp, but we haven't talked much about the consumers. There are, 4 different types of consumers: herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and scavengers. So your herbivores, they are typically your primary consumer because they only eat plants. If it is an herbivore, it only eats plants. And you know how I remember herbivore? The first 4 letters is herb. And I don't know if you've ever heard of an herb, but that's like plants, basically. It's seasonings you can put on things. So herbivore, I think of herbs, and herbs are plants. So I know that those type of consumers only eat plants. So those are things like rabbits, giraffes, horses, elephants. They don't eat other animals, and they have flat teeth so they can chew those plants. Then we have carnivores, and they only eat other animals. So they don't eat plants at all ever. They only eat the other animals. So those are like lions, panthers, owls, actually, and penguins. They don't eat plants, and they have sharp, pointy teeth to chew meat. So these carnivores are more than likely our secondary consumers because they will eat our herbivores, our primary consumers. Then we have something called omnivores, and omnivores is a little bit of both. They eat both plants and they eat animals. So bears eat both plants and animals. Turtles eat both plants and animals. Birds and people. We eat both plants and animals. We have pointy and flat teeth. So if you notice, some of our teeth are pointy, some of them are flat, and same with animals. Some have pointy teeth, like bears have big pointy teeth at the front, and then some of them in the back are nice and flat. So that's an omnivore. That can be a primary consumer or a secondary consumer. It could eat a plant and start off our food chain, or it can eat another animal. And finally, we have scavengers, and those are our decomposers. They eat those decaying animals. So once our consumers die, we have our scavengers like vultures, worms, hyenas, crabs. They are our cleanup crew. So raise your hand if you have ever seen a scavenger, like on the side of the road. Pretty gross, right? But that is a process of a food chain. So from now on, when you see that, you're going to know that it is all the circle of life that's happening. All right. So for your assignment today, you are going to do a matching right down below. So there are going to be some pictures of animals, and you're going to have to tell me, are they a producer, a consumer, omnivore, herbivore, all of those things, and you're going to have to match them. All right, guys, I love y'all so much. I will put this slide up on Canvas so you can remember what each of them are. And I will also put maybe a couple of these slides to remember. I might just put this whole PowerPoint so you can see it. All right, I love y'all so much. Have a great day.